Hi, and welcome to In Their Voices. In a turnaround today, I'm the one who's going to be interviewed by my friend Cinnie Noble. Hi, Cinnie.
Hi, Michael. Thank you for the honor of letting me interview you. I thought when I first suggested it that your eyes were going to pop out of your head, and then you seemed to like the idea. So I really like the idea because I've known you for a while, and there are things that I don't know about you that I'd like to take this opportunity to ask you about. So, one of the things that occurs to me that I'd love to know about you is, like others who've gone through the legal world and come out in the dispute resolution world. Tell me a bit about your path, how that happened for you.
Um, well, I'll tell you about my very first mediation. Um, uh, I had been practicing law in a small town in Maine, in Freeport. Uh, Fairly typical small town kind of practice, some real estate work, wills, occasional divorces. I didn't do any criminal work, no traffic citations, anything like that. And I wasn't heavily involved in litigation, but other kinds of things that were typical of a small town practice. And I joined a training group of therapists, even though I was not and never have been a therapist. I joined a training group studying transactional analysis and Gestalt therapy.
Wow.
And I was in that group for 3 years. Um, and some of my friends and colleagues in the group would begin to refer individuals well, mostly individuals at that time to me for representation in divorce because they figured that I would come about it in the least adversarial manner possible.
Mm-hmm.
And one day, a couple came in who had been referred by a local couple, and they'd been referred by one of the people in the group, one of the therapists. I was the only non-therapist in the group. And they said, we want you to represent the marriage. And I said, well, I can't do that ethically, and went through all of the, obvious ethical limitations about prescriptions about representing two parties to the same transaction. I gave them a friendly but standard spiel. And the fellow said, well, look, we want you to work with us because we think that your way of approaching this is compatible with the way we want to handle our divorce. So we need to figure out a way to do that. And he said, if you gave me a letter that said that you weren't representing me, that you were clearly representing my wife, could we still have this conversation? And I thought about it and I said, sure, why not? He said, write the letter. And that was my first mediation.
Wow.
Yeah, I got drawn into it, and I loved it because it was so consistent with the way in which I was working with divorcing couples anyway, which was just the influence of what I was learning in the therapy practice was to shine sort of a broad light on the whole relationship and to see the nuances and the shadows and the textures. Whereas as a lawyer, we're more trained to look like a laser beam, focus on specific elements and data and issues and so on. And I found that in this conversation with the couple, and we had, it's the best I can recall, this is 1978, I think 2 or 3 meetings is all we needed. And I loved it because I was able to use everything that I knew about being a lawyer in terms of problem solving, being able to focus on issues, gather facts, think them through, make good choices, and as a mediator, help them over the rough spots when they would be talking to one another and would get entangled in conflict.
And was mediation yet a thing where you were working?
Never heard the word.
No.
No. And then, so I talked about this in my therapy training group, and one by one, people started to come to me.
Yeah.
And it wasn't very many. You know, I would maybe do 5 or 6 mediations in a year. And then I discovered that there were actually some other mediators in Maine. They were doing small claims mediation, not family, and tried to make some contact. Then I discovered that there were actually a couple of other people who were wanting to do family mediation, and became friendly with them. And that's really how I got started. And then it was a very slow evolution. I couldn't just stop practicing law. I needed the income. I was married. We had 3 children, and my wife. The children were young. The youngest was 4 or 5 at the time.
Mm.
So my wife wasn't working full time, their mom, and we had to be a wage earner. So the transition from being a small town lawyer to being a small town lawyer plus mediator took a long time.
Wow.
Built over a period of a decade.
Wow, that's quite a background, quite a story. And so you eventually moved out of your legal practice and started to do mediation. Would you say full time, or what happened there?
I never was able to. Here's what was happening is that over the next 14 years, so until 1992, I was continuing to practice law and do mediation, but the amount of mediation work versus the amount of law would grow every single year. So that by 1992, and I'll explain why that date has significance, probably 75% of my practice was mediation and 25% practice of law. And then sorry, you go ahead.
Before you tell me what happened that sort of was a turning point in 92, I'm curious about how the transactional analysis and Gestalt group that you belong to informed how you developed a mediation practice. I know initially what you've said, but I'm kind of curious about how you developed a model of mediation that eventually became a bigger part of your life.
I think what had helped me is, and the way in which it shaped and influenced, was the emphasis on the relational. Mm-hmm. Even though people were disconnecting in their marriage, they remained related. And especially if they were going to have children, they would remain related for an extended period of time, if not indefinitely. And so I tended to focus on how they were engaged with one another or became disengaged with one another. And the sort of the theory of transactional analysis helped me sort of identify where the problem areas might be that I could help them overcome. But it wasn't helping them overcome in the way that a therapist might, you know, to adjust their emotional reactions to things. It was helping them overcome those challenges, those places where they were really at odds with one another in order to do one specific thing, to make a decision. And so that's how I evolved my practice. And can I tell you a secret?
Of course, nobody will hear, just you and me.
Right.
And everybody listening.
You want to know the date of my first 40-hour family mediation training course?
When was that?
December 2008.
Wow. Oh my goodness.
I had never taken the traditional path of a 40-hour course. I didn't know that that's what I was supposed to do. There was nothing like that available to me that I knew about until I was fairly well, maybe in the middle 80s, and felt fairly confident about what I was doing. So there was no requirement for me to have the course. There was no licensure certification at the time. So I would take advanced training programs, go to conferences and attend workshops, but never a basic training course until 40 years or 30 years after I actually started mediating.
And why did you decide to do it then?
Well, I didn't have a choice. If I wanted to be that's right. If I wanted to be a certified mediator in Florida, there was no provision in the regulations for grandparenting.
Okay.
Everybody, didn't matter who you were, how big a deal you might be, or not. You had to take the course, and you had to do 10 hours of supervision, which was
wow.
observation. But yeah.
I'd like to hear what happened in 1992, but before you go there on this topic, I'm kind of curious, Michael, how all that you had done for a lot of years prior to that time, with that background with TA and Gestalt, what happened when you were learning steps? Like, how did you integrate what you knew and what you were learning?
Well, I always understood, from my practice of law, what the elements were that the issues, the topics that people would want to talk about. And so I didn't worry about stages in that sense. I would always introduce myself. I mean, I always knew that, because that's how I would practice law, would be to talk to people, my clients, about what we were going to do together, what ground rules there might be about confidentiality, things like that. So in that sense, I was, like all, I think, good professionals, we all do some sort of an introduction. So when I began hearing about people doing things in stages, I said, oh, well, okay, I already do that stage. That's no problem. And by the time I learned about that people were doing stages, I thought, well, it makes a lot of sense if what you're thinking about is trying to teach mediators about the elements that are necessary as part of the process. Mm-hmm. But it made no sense to me that they had to follow a particular pattern. For me, I had learned through all of my experience that people will move in different, they're unique. And how they want to have a conversation about something as intimate and as important as their divorce is their own way. Mm. And if they want to talk about money, then we talk about money. If they want to talk about the kids first, then we talk about the kids first. I never assumed that there was a particular way. In fact, I had a funny experience, Cinnie. I did an advanced, I was the instructor, did a 2-day advanced workshop at the Justice Institute in BC. And this was for mediators who had been in practice at least 5 years and had completed all of the requirements for their certificate from the JI. And the very first day, someone said something to me about, well, what stage is that in? And I said, come on. I said, what are you talking about? And they said, well, you mediate in stages. And I said, let me just ask you something. Nobody here but us. Can we just have this little conversation? I said, be honest with yourselves and with me. Have any of you ever done a live mediation where you went stage 1, 2, 3, 4? And the 25 people said, no. That's because you shouldn't. And the sigh of relief in the room it was palpable, you know? So, yeah, I remember reading, for example, Chris Moore's book, the mediation process, and all of his stages, and his descriptions were so detailed and elegant and rich, and I felt like it would have been a straitjacket for me to try to work that way. I got the idea that all of those are pieces to the puzzle, but the people I'm working with get to decide what pieces they're going to put together first and second,
Right.
third. Yeah.
Yes. So I'm so intrigued because you brought up 1992, and you'd say later, what was that 1992? What part of your life?
Yeah, I was hired by Antioch to create a graduate program, a master's program in conflict resolution.
That must have been one of the first ones around, huh?
I think we were the third or fourth.
Third or fourth, okay. Yeah, there weren't that many at that time, I don't think.
Mason was the first. Trying to remember, I think Nova Southeastern had a program. I don't remember now, but we were fairly early on. There was not a long history of programs at the time. And it meant leaving Maine and moving to Ohio. So when I left Maine, I resigned from the bar and looked back. So I never had a moment when, well, after I started working at Antioch and then worked at other universities, it was then that all of my professional life, my focus was on conflict resolution.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Well, that was perfectly timed then to move you on. It sounds like you were ready for that shift.
I was very ready in lots of ways. It was hard on my family. That wasn't the easiest part, but yeah, I absolutely was ready. It was a remarkable opportunity to build something from scratch.
So from all of that background, and there may be more that you'd want to share before getting to how the concept of reflective practice became a huge driver in your life. Is there anything before we get to that you want to make sure we talk about?
I don't think so necessarily. Yeah, thanks.
So let's hear about that. It's a huge area of interest of mine, as you know, and I'm wondering what were the drivers for you?
I'm by nature, I think, because I'm a bit of an introvert. I go inside and I process and I think about and I mull over, and I naturally wonder about experiences, both in the immediate, you know, when something is happening, and then taking a step back. So I think that there was something in my wiring, in my being, that I was pretty open to this idea. And also, I was really, really hungry to learn more about how people become good mediators. I've been practicing, you know, winging it in a very conscientious and benevolent way. But I have to say, you know, learning as I went along how to do mediation for a number of years. And then I went to a conference, and I've written about this. I'll abbreviate the story. As an introvert, and as somebody having never been in a proper 40-hour training at that point, this was 1985, nobody had ever seen me mediate. And I'd really never seen anybody else. So I went to this conference and I made a decision, as an introvert, I was going to be cocktail party man. you know, that I was, meaning that I was going to engage anybody and everybody in a conversation, whether it was for 2 minutes or an hour.
Wow.
I wasn't going to just, I just going to force myself to do that, to meet people and to learn in meeting them. And I also made a decision before I arrived that anytime I was in a session and there was an opportunity to do a role play and to be a mediator, I would volunteer. And sure enough, the first morning, there I was. And I attended this workshop because I guess one other little piece I can fill in is in the, I don't remember, it was 83, 84, thereabouts. I studied family therapy for a couple of years at a family therapy institute. And one of the people we read about was Milton Erickson, a psychiatrist. And there I opened the program for this conference. The first workshop is Ericksonian hypnotherapy approaches to mediation.
Wow.
I thought, okay, this one's got my name on it. I'm definitely attending. And it was a full morning. So the first half of the morning, the presenters did a magnificent job of describing a variety of intervention techniques that Erickson was noted for. I think there were 20, 25, something like that. They had butcher paper up around 3 sides of the room, you know, with large lettering. It was magnificent what they had done, all the preparation. And so they come back from a break and they say, okay, now we're going to do, we want to do a role play mediation and see if you can try out any of these techniques. And so I volunteered, and the setup was that they asked a person who was having difficulty with a client in a mediation to be that client, to be that person, and then somebody else to be that person's spouse. And I don't know whether you know John Amundsen from Calgary. He's a psychotherapist.
Yeah, I know the name.
Okay. That John was the one who volunteered a situation.
Okay.
And he played the wife. And Linda Girdner, a wonderful mediator, played the husband. And the issue that John was talking about had to do with a highly competent, effective, bright, able, thoughtful spouse who happened to be the wife, who in the mediation was having all sorts of difficulty tracking, making sense of things. And he said he had clearly ruled out any issue about domestic abuse. I mean, even in 1985, you know, he was cognizant of that. And as a psychotherapist, that would make sense. So we did the mediation, and it went on for about 20 or 25 minutes. I had no idea how long until I was told afterwards, because I was just right there, scared, you know, but just determined I was going to do what seemed the right thing to do. And the 2 presenters came up and they put one each, a hand on my shoulder, and said that was brilliant.
Wow.
I was stunned. And as part of the feedback, both John and Linda acknowledged that that was really helpful. John said, I could feel myself becoming calmer, more able to focus. I could hear what was going on. People congratulated me. People would say, come up to me afterwards, say, yeah, lawyer, are you? Lawyers don't know how to do that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Well, you're brave for going up there.
Yeah. And I would go back to we were staying on a college campus, and I go back to my little Spartan dorm room and feel bereft and lost because I hadn't a clue what I had done.
Mm.
And I couldn't figure it out. I didn't know why whatever I had done worked. And I sure knew that whatever I had done was I could never replicate because I didn't have the tools that I needed to be able to understand what was happening and what I was doing. And it happened that I met Robert Benjamin at that conference. And we were talking, and he said, "So, Michael, there's this book I think you ought to read." Mm. So I said, "Yeah, okay, sure, Robert, I will. Thanks, I appreciate the suggestion," and went home and forgot about it for about 6 months. And then I thought, I'm going to read this book. I bought the book and I went, oh my gosh. Now I have a way of trying to understand what goes on, how I was making choices, what I was thinking, what I was hearing and seeing and taking in that was influencing my thinking that led to my making a decision.
Wow.
That I had some of a structure of Ericksonian hypnotherapy only because I'd studied family therapy and we had studied a bit of Milton Erickson in one of the segments. And so I did have a bit of theory, but I wasn't cognizant at the time that that's what I was actually using. And I thought, oh, I was accessing that in a way that allowed me to make smart choices about the interventions with that kind of a structure in mind. And that's 35 years ago. And, here I am.
And the whole idea of thinking about our thinking and what propels us to do what we do and to question that, it's in some ways a luxury that many of us who are mediators don't have the opportunity to do that. And it occurs to me that the whole idea of reflective practice is one that some people probably include in their training. I don't know who does, but it seems to me it would be an integral part of becoming a mediator, that what's included in your training and growth and development over a period of time is something that would be a reflective practice. What are your thoughts about that?
I only know of 2 people. I'm sure that there are others. I don't mean it to be exclusive, but I know that both Susan Terry and I include that as part of our basic mediation training courses, not just in advanced training or specialized kind of courses or workshops on reflective practice. So, you see, I start with the idea that that you need a structure in order to be able to do your work effectively. It doesn't, you can't just have a bunch of tools. You need to have an understanding of what those tools are most effectively used for and in what circumstances. And there are that same tool or technique, a form of question, for example, could be used by a dozen mediators in a dozen different ways, each of them doing it brilliantly and effectively. And the reason is because they have a theory that shapes their understanding of the conflict situation. And on the basis of that theory, they say, this kind of an intervention is most likely to be a useful one. So I begin in the first day with an introduction to theory. And I explain exactly what the theory is intended to do and give them lots of examples about it. Because without that, it's difficult to do reflective practice. Otherwise, what people say is, oh yeah, I do reflective practice. I think about, when I'm driving home from the office, I think about that, and I said, well, tell me what you think about. And they said, well, I think about, well, this person said this, and, we got that far, and was, we got a pretty good deal, and it was okay in the end. And I'm being simplistic, I realize, but the point is that there's not a sense of how the choices that the mediator made were shaped by her understanding of the interactions between the parties. And that we all have a lens that we use, or a series of lenses. I've used that metaphor, and many, many of them, hundreds of people use it to talk about the value and the meaning of theory. That it's a way of seeing things, making sense out of situations and circumstances. So that's how I describe it at the beginning. And then we build from there. And I demonstrate through the kinds of role play feedback I do. I definitely do not do, let me tell you what you did well, let me tell you what you still need to work on, sort of feedback. Or even worse, to my mind, is asking them to define what they did well and what they need to work on when they're trying to learn how to do this in the first place. It boggles my mind that could happen.
So what are the questions you'd be asking?
Well, I will say, for example, say to a mediator in the role, pardon me, in the role play, say, when you decided to do X as an intervention, what were you thinking? What was going through your mind? Because that's what I'm interested in, is the analysis that they do. Because if I ask them, why did you do that? There's a very high risk. That's really what I want to understand, is the why. But if I ask the question why, there's a good chance they'll shut down. They'll get defensive. They'll give me some glib answer in order to get me to back off. And I don't want that. Similarly, if I just say, well, let me tell you what you did well, and let me tell you what you need to work on, and that's how I initiate the conversation, there's no room for self-analysis. And what I say is that the self-analysis, the self-exploration is the key. Because once you finish this training, you're on your own. And you need to have some tools to help you do the best you can. And it isn't, how to ask a question, or how to do reframing, or how to summarize, or all of that. Yes, you got it. You better have all of that down. But the problem is deciding when and how to use it, or why to use it. So I think it makes all the difference in the world, because what I'm doing is helping them become learners, not just students.
So I'm curious. I have read your books and I understand, but I think it would help me to hear what you'd say as an answer to what is the anticipated outcome for somebody who has a reflective practice.
You mean for somebody who has that outlook?
Yeah, somebody who engages, who has reflective practice in their work, what distinguishes them from people that don't in the end?
I think that they are, among other things, first of all, they're more resilient. They're able to respond to the unique circumstances of the situation. Of course, you know, if you're doing a certain type of workplace mediation or divorce mediation, there are lots of things that are similar. And yet there are so many things about the people and their circumstances that are utterly unique. And so it helps us stay resilient and responsive to what's actually taking place and not make leaps of assumption. Secondly, when we do make assumptions, part of the process is to test them, not act on them as though they are truth, as though I've got it, you know, the eureka moment. No. There is a bit of that. There's a bit of that. I think I've got a great idea as to what's happening here. Now I need to figure out whether what I think is happening matches what the party's experience is and what they think is happening. Because if there isn't that match, I'm not going to be very helpful. Mm-hmm. It builds a sense of curiosity. It's really easy for us to get into a mode, no matter how gentle or elicitive we might be when we're asking questions. If the purpose is interrogatory, if the purpose is to gather facts, details, information, we may miss a whole lot if we're not curious about those things that might go unsaid or the nuances of something that's said. So part of the quality of a reflective practitioner is somebody who is just endlessly curious. I describe it as being, excuse me, very much like a 5-year-old, and who comes to you and asks a question and says, so why is this happening? And you say, well, okay, here's the answer to that. And the child nods and says, why? Mm-hmm. You answer the question again, and the child says, why? And this can go on endlessly. And the reason is, it can feel annoying, but that's not the purpose. The purpose is that they're voracious learners. Everything is new and uncertain to them, and they just can't get enough. They can't learn enough. They can't explore enough. I mean, they're crawling around on the floor. They're putting stuff in their mouths. They're touching things maybe they ought not to be touching. You know, they're explorers. And we need to be explorers too. And the process of reflective practice helps us maintain that sense of wonder that is the essence of curiosity, so that we don't operate on a sense of assurance. I'm the professional. I know what's right. I've done this 1,000 times. I'm good at it, and so on. Yes, all of that is true. And no matter how many times you've done a divorce mediation or a workplace mediation, you've never done it with these people.
Right.
And they've never done it with you. And if you're not really curious, you're going to miss signs that I'll give you an example. It actually happened in a role play, and it was about a workplace dispute between coworkers, one of whom felt that the other was being disrespectful, just constantly putting him down, and being very competitive. And they worked out, in the role play, they worked out an agreement about what respect meant and all of that. It looked pretty straightforward, nicely done. And when the mediator was reviewing the agreement with the parties, one of them said, yes, that's exactly what I was thinking. And the other one said, yeah, it's okay. And the mediator said to himself, I don't know what that means. And decided to speak separately with each of them. And the person who said, yeah, okay, said, this isn't going to solve anything.
Mm.
because the real issue is that he wants my job. And we haven't discussed that. So the mediator goes back to the other role player and says, I don't want his job. I want his boss's job, but I don't want his job. His job's secure. I don't want him. I want him to succeed, not fail. I don't want to make him look bad. Came back together again, had that conversation. Now they really had an agreement. And it's so easy to miss those nuances if you're not really paying attention and you're not really careful.
Wow, that's a really great example. I was just going to ask you if you give an example of what's happened when people have pursued the idea of what they're hearing, and what if two people, mediators, were doing that or more, would someone pick up on that or not, or they think they've got a deal or not.
If you don't mind, can I give you another example?
Yes.
Because it occurred very recently in one of the reflective practice groups that I run. And it's a good example of the process of self-exploration. So the person who was presenting, and in our groups, what the participants are asked to present, the group members are asked to do, is to present a puzzling situation, practice situation. It could be puzzling because they just are confused. It could be because it didn't go the way they wanted, and something didn't feel right. Or it could have been spectacularly successful and they're clueless. Just wondering.
Could work either way.
Right. So the mediator was talking about difficulties with, and I'm going to do this in a way that's trying to protect confidentiality, of course. A particular problem that the mediator was having with certain types of situations. And the mediator gave a couple of examples of a client who was being, seemed to be resistant and difficult, that every time an option was proposed, it was, no, that's not going to work. No, that's not going to work. No, that's not going to work. And the mediator described working really hard to come up with more and more options to try to massage things and so on. And the natural response of some of the other members was to start offering, well, have you tried this? And did you think about this? And my question was, why do you think that's going on?
Mm-hmm.
What's happening for you when this is occurring? What's taking place? And the mediator began to explore, or discovered really, that the problem was the mediator's outlook. The mediator saw themselves as the problem solver,
mm-hmm.
doer, instead of the parties as the problem solvers and doers. And was earnest and heartfelt and really, really smart and very capable as a problem solver. And it was hard to let go of that. And instead to see the mediator as a facilitator of their problem solving. That the mediator had a host of tools and techniques to use that could induce, support, encourage the parties to do their own work.
Right.
And when the mediator realized that it was the mediator's orientation, not the lack of skills. Because actually that's how I began. I said, you've got all the skills in the world. Everything that everybody might say is great and useful in a way, but you've got all those skills. That's not the problem, is it? And that's how we approached it.
It's interesting because I notice this in coaching as well, reflective practice and coaching, that what happens is, I think, is people discover often when they are questioned about thinking about their thinking, that it may be a mindset, it may be being a rescuer, it might be, this is how I help people, I want them to succeed. It is maybe a problem-solving mindset, but it's also a need that the practitioner has. And when I think about in coaching, that's a huge discovery for people. And I'm hearing that that's similar to what one of the elements of reflective practice that you see in the DR field.
Absolutely. It is, and you know, there are some people whose philosophy about mediation is, I'm the deal maker. I am the deal creator. And the whole point of this is to bring two or more people together and to get them to make a deal. I'm using my language very carefully when I say that, because that's the mindset. Well, if that's the mindset and that's the philosophy, and the mediator is really, really clear about that, I might not like that. I might not value that as something that I would ever want to undertake. I might not think of it as mediation. But what I can respect is that there's a clear theory, if you will, a clear set of beliefs that then translates into action. And what I am concerned about is especially when the action is and the theory are not aligned.
Right.
So in this case, you know, the mediator could have said, you know, this is my job, and I can explain why I think it's my job is to build agree, you know, and so on. We would have had a slightly different conversation. But
right.
The mediator said that the problem solving was clearly the responsibility of the parties. Now, I've just summarized an hour-long conversation with this meeting. So, you know, there's a lot of nuance in there. There's a lot of detail that I've necessarily left out, not just for confidentiality.
So, Michael, there's so much really to talk about. I am so admiring of the whole idea of reflective practice in our field, and have seen it as part of training, as I said, rarely. And I know that you run reflective practice groups as well through the ABA, I think. Have I got the right form that you would do this in?
I do a group for the ABA.
ABA, yeah.
With Susan Terry, I do a group for ACR.
Okay.
I do a group for the Academy of Professional Family Mediators.
Wow.
And a group for the Nebraska Mediation Association.
Goodness. Oh, that's fantastic. So it's really starting to move. People are interested in how they're going to incorporate reflective practice.
Right.
We're going to wind down pretty soon. I'm kind of, you've had such a distinguished career with a variety of things where you've grown yourself and you've developed, you write and you teach and you've designed all sorts of things that are really a tribute to how your skills have grown over time. And I'm kind of curious to ask you, this might be a hard one, when you look back on the trajectory, what are the moments that you think, oh, I'm so glad I did this? That was a really important part of my success.
Well, I tell you, that first meeting, being asked to represent the marriage is such a key point.
Okay, that was pivotal for you.
Yeah, because it set me on a trajectory that has made all the difference to me.
Yeah.
I have, from that day forward, I've loved being a mediator, whether it's as a writer, as a teacher, or a practitioner.
Oh, that's great.
So that certainly has been one. I think the other thing is that I'm willing to take risks. And the decision to go to Antioch was a huge risk.
Mm.
I was not steeped in academia. I was going into an organization where I had a JD, not a PhD, and concerned how that would be seen by my colleagues on the faculty. It required building. There was nothing except an idea for the program, and it had to be built from scratch. And fairly quickly, I I was able to recruit an assistant director, and together she and I, and she was great in the sense that she came from a more traditional academic background, was very much steeped in theory, whereas with a little bit of knowledge of practitioner, and I had sort of the flip of that. So taking that kind of a risk, and moving as well. You know, we lived in Maine for 20 years. We were very content. We knew everybody, and you know, it's a small place. I had intimate friends, and so that was a big risk. I think that's the thing, is that I have been willing to leap into the unknown.
Yeah.
Sometimes look back and say, well, that was kind of foolish. You know, maybe that was a little bit bigger leap than you thought you were going to take. But yeah, as I think about it, those are the things, the willingness to try something new, and to say, it isn't that I have immense confidence that I can do it. I have a pretty good sense that I could do it, but I'm willing to learn.
Right.
Yeah.
Those sound like really good tips to pass on, especially to new practitioners and people thinking about where they fit in our field. And
Yeah.
there are certainly, over time, there have been so many very creative ways that practitioners have found where they belong and what their niche is within this very broad field. And as we wind down, then I would be curious to ask is, are there any other tips that you would want to pass on to new practitioners, or not necessarily new, but just about being in the field and what you think it takes to do the work you love?
You know, what occurs to me, this is going to sound curious, and I'm going to take you back even farther in time to the late 1950s when I was a sophomore, in between my sophomore and junior years in high school. And the comment from my English teacher, whom I feared and loved, feared because he was a very imposing and distant man in a way, and yet a very nurturing guy. Oddly enough, a very nurturing guy as well. And his comment to my parents, written comment at the end of the school year, was, Mike should read voraciously over the summer. And I think that that's a key for the new people in our field. It's so easy and understandable that when people are fresh, they just want to get in, they want to do, and they say, I'm done with the learning, I've got my skills, and it is to learn voraciously, whether it's by reading, whether it's by attending workshops, whether it's by being in peer groups like those that I run or others, but to be just omnivorously hungry to learn something every single time you sit with a client, is to prepare yourself and to say, something's going to happen here that is unexpected, and I'm going to learn from it. And at the end of this, I'm going to sit with myself, maybe for 2 minutes is all it takes, and I'm going to figure out what it was that I learned.
Wow. It's interesting because there's been a common theme amongst around your stories, which is around curiosity, and you certainly walk the talk around that. It's great. So what last words would you like to say as we close up today, our time together? What have I missed? What else would you like to add?
Oh, Cinnie, you know, there are far too many things probably. We could keep going. As much as I was anxious about doing this and feeling a bit self-conscious, it's easier for me to do the one who's asking the questions than others. You know, to be the one, and no, I think this may end with something quite silly as well, but Gary Larson is one of my favorite cartoonists. And there's a cartoon shows a classroom and of the children sitting at their desks. And there's a child in the front row who has an unaccountably tiny, tiny, tiny head. And has his hand raised, or her, and says, "Teacher, may I be excused? My brain is full." I'm feeling.
Is your brain full?
I'm feeling full and grateful.
Well, I am too. Thank you so much for trusting me with all that fabulous history and more about you. And I really appreciate it, Michael. Thank you.
Thanks.